We have recently seen people help to archive the White House pages for the Internet Archive, the extraction and removal of all the data related to climate change moved out of the US, and even government agencies refusing to hand over data to the White House as a form of ethical protest. We have heard calls to raise students had voluntarily turned in their information for registry during the Obama administration. And we have watched librarians, scientists, and other information workers save the endangered data being raised by our current government. I wonder then, have we hit another critical turn in the digital humanities? Again, how do we answer Tara McPherson's question? Quote, so if we are always already complicit with the machine, what are we to do? Unquote. So designing mechanisms of complicity and train. One answer to this question is to consider if there are ways to use the machine to underscore the ethical lessons of the Third Reich's use of its racialized genocide. I looked at Brenda Romero's work on the mechanic is the message. In this series of analog games that are also forms of conceptual art, Romero, a major feminist game pioneer, attempts to work through the experience of complicity that harnesses the mechanics of the game to make players face ethical, social, and often devastating complicity in various catastrophic world tragedies, all linked to various kinds of racial religious discrimination. In particular, I want to turn my attention to Train. All of Romero's games, she has finished The New World about the Middle Passage, the Irish game about Cromwell's conquest of Ireland and slaughter of the Irish, One Falls for Each of Us about the Trail of Tears, and Train, she's currently prototyping Mexican kitchen workers, which is about undocumented kitchen workers, are not for the public buying market. There is only one copy of each game that she keeps in her home. She personally constructs these analog games, which often means she paints the parts individually, she builds certain props, she brings personal items into this game world. She, like the punch card operators, has an intimate relationship with the material and structural parts of this game mechanism. Train is usually played in organized events at universities and in art museums, a hybrid game art installation. She has spoken about Train in video talks. There is extensive media coverage about Train, and a couple of videos that document groups playing Train at individual events. Otherwise, one cannot actually examine the game unless you have seen it or seen it being played, or through the filters of accounts vis-a-vis video articles and personal conversation with witnesses. Train is set up with 3 railroad tracks on top of a white framed window with a black Nazi typewriter at the end and several trains and numerous wood and yellow figures. The rules of the game are placed in the typewriter. As Brian Upton explains, quote, the object of Train is to load small yellow pawns into boxcars and move as many of them as one can along the tracks to their final destinations. Initially, players aren't given any context for these actions. The game presents itself simply as a logistical challenge. Only when the first boxcar arrives and the Auschwitz card is revealed does the metaphoric significance of their earlier moves become apparent, unquote. Upton further explains that what makes this game a work of art is how the rules are constructed. Romero has created a set of rules that are deliberately broken. They contain strange contradictions and ambiguities. Players are forced to come up with their own negotiated interpretations as they play. Several different plays of the game have resulted in different actions by the players. Some have immediately, upon seeing the setup, refused to play until the game ends. Others have only realized after the first card is read, release the yellow figures or hidden figures so the trains arrive at their destinations without any bodies. Romero describes that she has had one group, and particularly one competitive player, actually become swept up in the play of the game, who finished the game by delivering all their Jewish bodies to various concentration camps. This group broke down after the game was won by the one competitive player. They began a series of angry recriminations toward this one player that reverberated well past the end of the game. This game and its effects are less portable. They go beyond the space of the game itself. Visually, several players have immediately identified the objects of Train as part of the Holocaust. The glass in the window eventually got smashed entirely by one player. The window signifies Kristallnacht. The Nazi typewriter links Train to the holograph punch card machine and its deadly efficiency. She also used difficult-sized yellow pawns so that loading these bodies onto the train required player discomfort and hardship. What Romero has structured in her game design conceptual art piece is complicity. She's used the difficulty, horror, and excruciating discomfort of that complicity to force her players to confront their place in its violent systems and regimes. The fascinating side effect to this game is that it then forces players to stretch their ethical empathy. So to answer Tara McPherson's question, so if we are always already complicit with the machine, what are we to do? I would answer we center the difficult feelings of complicity and we turn our labors to resist. And in the example of Romero's training, we can see how the design of a game system can help change the stakes of players, user readers, ethical engagement, and the devastating politics of our world. We design our computational databases, data algorithm systems with the centrality of justice, with an understanding of our complicity, with a reminder of our most terrible histories. So database design is centering the marginal reader. Because it is an interactive narrative play system, one of the standard tenets in digital and video game design is that you always build for the player. Likewise, in an interactive DH database and archives projects, we always design for the purported public audience. But what reader, user, player bodies are we centering in this design and building? Databases are not neutral because audiences themselves are not neutral. Our scholarly database design privileges an imagined universal community of white, male, benign, and benevolent audience members. This is also the case for our data, our algorithms, our computer languages, which have always been touted as something universal and for all, but really designed for the man. I would argue that the universal audience is one link to the white male enlightened subject of the 18th century. Yet, as the work of biopolitics, and particularly as Celia Winters and Alexander Wehilea discuss, what bodies matter. In Alexander Wehelea's Habeas Fiscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human, he articulates a biopolitics filtered through Black feminism that decenters whiteness and centralizes race in this discussion. Wehilea describes the Black studies and Black feminist intervention in biopolitics. Based on Celia Winters' work, he explains that race is not biological or cultural, but rather a conglomerate of socio-political relations that discipline humanity into full humans, not quite human, and non-humans. In essence, then, race is a political system that orders what bodies matter and encompasses both the cultural and biological discussion of those bodies. Wehilea particularly critiques the discourses around biopolitics in their life to explicate how much they have disregarded critical race studies in relationship to thinking about the category of human, and imagines a universal biological substance that is separate from race. Wehilea and Winters' work puts pressure on us to center marginal communities and marginal bodies when we build our databases. We must ask what bodies matter and what happens if we center the most intersectional and vulnerable bodies in our digital scholarly work. Who gets to be human? There is also another urgency to center the most marginal bodies in the imagined audience community for digital humanities, databases, projects, and archives. In literary studies, two theories of textual reading, reader response theory and reception theory, have had a long and deep history. I can point to both the scribbled marginalia of medieval readers, often on the side of manuscripts, to the opening section of Samuel Purchas's To the Reader. Both these literary theories focus on the way in which literary works are received by readers. My focus in bringing biopolitics and reader response theory and historical reception theory is to examine how both critical race studies and critical whiteness studies will change our digital design decisions. Though we have theorized and considered the worlds of the resistant or even suspicious reader, we are at a critical juncture when we must address the place and decide our engagement or not with a hostile, harassing reader who is interested in alt facts, interpretation, and fascist ideological propaganda. We cannot build with a neutral, universal audience reader community in mind anymore because this alt-right audience reads neutrality in certain areas of our literary and cultural canon as a location for a white supremacist fascist agenda. As a medievalist, I can say this centering has to be done by all areas in the English literary world because the textual and visual rhetoric of the white supremacists, white nationalists, and fascists currently sitting in prominent positions in the White House are also connoisseurs of the Middle Ages, and most recently Jane Austen. There is an urgency for us to rethink our digital scholarly structures, databases, data, projects in relation to a hostile, harassing, toxic audience that will read neutrality as a form of agreeing with our white supremacist ideologies. For example, the largest number of bodies encounter the Middle Ages through digital video game culture. Yet digital video game culture centers an idea that the medieval past is always white and thus part of a white nationalist narrative. One cannot see an image of a historical crusader without it being identified as a fascist sign. Or recently, as the anti-fascists explained their graffiti campaign at the University of Texas in Austin last year, they have identified Celtic cross graffiti, a symbol of the Aryan nation, as a white supremacist cultural sign that their own graffiti at specific fraternities were fighting against. These canonical literary cultural objects are not neutral anymore, and they are not seen as benign. Instead, we have a hostile audience ready to repurpose them that transforms the power dynamics of these literary cultural figures, texts, and objects into a white supremacist rhetorical tool. Similarly, there is an urgency to support, design, build, and preserve DH databases and archive projects that focus on the cultural production of marginalized groups. The same hostile and harassing white supremacist, white nationalist manosphere reading community has been co-opting these historical figures, authors, texts, and objects. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center and Sophia Noble's work on Dylan Roof's digital white supremacy is an example of how co-option happens. Roof Googled Martin Luther King Jr. and found a series of white supremacist sites dedicated to MLK. This is basically his further internet research led him to an information cascade in which opening up one such white supremacist MLK link would then have the algorithm suggest other similar sorts of sites. Likewise, a colleague recently explained to me that when she, several years ago, Googled Aslan, white supremacist, white nationalist, and anti-immigration sites would be what was at the top of the Google search board. This is why we need to invest in work that is being done by projects like Chicana Cormi Raza, which has no actual funding other than the sort of love and labor of various librarians and scholars. I think we can move away from the question of why are the digital humanities so white to how do we make an anti-fascist digital humanities? How do we make a digital humanities that centers social justice, a digital humanities that can harness the power of DH on behalf of marginal communities? Edward Arriaga at an MSU Global DH conference in 2017 argued that decolonizing the digital is happening in Global South communities through open access social media platforms that communities are repurposing for their own cultural political ends, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, etc. I agree that this is the space where digital decoloniality is occurring for marginal groups. However, I also believe that we cannot just see the institutional space, especially in this time of crisis. Recently, we only just found out that the budget approvals in the US government will fund NEH and IMLS and several other agencies, and they will actually survive next week, if not the next year, and possibly a year and a half. But nonetheless, I believe the precarity of our own institutions are palpable, and their survival is precarious still. Therefore, I know this means that university institutions, and especially its libraries, are going to have to step up as we live in a time of crisis. What I do know that is that the bodies and communities most vulnerable and with the least resources will have the least options to access spaces, tools, resources, and platform and archival stability in the near future. I want a resistant digital humanities. I'm modeling this idea on what I have seen happening in the anti-fascist science communities, especially the hashtag Black in STEM, particularly the vocal critique of the Science March, Marginal Science, and also for the recent conference organized by the Zapatistas, the Los Zapatistas y las conciencias por la humanidad. This conference focused on twinned and intertwined themes, quote, an interrogation of science and the oppressive force, and the potential through this awareness to harness the power of science on behalf of indigenous communities. These should be the twin goals of the digital humanities. We must interrogate DH's history as an oppressive force and then through this awareness harness its power on behalf of marginalized communities. I end with a new question. How do we build the digital humanities for the anti-fascist resistance that centers race, gender, disability? What does the digital humanities resistance look like? Thank you. Am I supposed to take questions?
Will you be willing to take
questions? I'm totally willing to take questions. It's a long and, as I said, promiscuous, long-duration history.
I might start. Thank you for that talk that, as you say, covered lots of different areas. As a medievalist, I was really intrigued by your suggestion that we build databases that have kind of a sense of non-neutral audiences. And I think that's what we're used to. And how would you suggest we go over that?
For instance, I can take the example of Jane Austen, which has recently become, to the horror of a lot of 18th century colleagues, the sort of new pet cultural object of the alt-right. And I would say if it was just a sort of what would be imagined as a neutral Jane Austen scholarly edition database thing, they would be all over it. They would absolutely be all over it. You have to do things that sort of signal a different kind of engagement. I would do global Jane Austen. I would think about her reading communities. I don't think there has been much discussion, from what I understand, about her reading communities globally and around the world and things like that. I think one of the reasons, interestingly, that Shakespeare hasn't really been co-opted in global in its performance production for a really long time, and that's a, if that makes sense. It's interesting because you would think, okay, well, you're trying to co-opt classics, you're trying to go after the Middle Ages, you're going after Jane Austen. Why isn't Shakespeare part of that group? But interestingly, because of the way that they've developed as a field and their sort of emphasis on global performance and global Shakespeare, it has stopped that kind of infiltration from those groups. So I think this is I think it's really complicated, for instance, if you do a Crusaders project, because you have a minefield to deal with. And I think, particularly if you're interested in projects that are accessible to the public, but that often means the public are involved in some way, you don't want the kind of situation where you have like what we see in Wikipedia wars, right? Where basically it's sort of like, different editorial bodies basically in sort of, digital warfare about certain topics, right? Or what has happened in some sort of other spaces. Similarly, there was the whole scandal with GitHub several years ago. This has happened in a lot of what has been imagined as utopic, open source, open community, development spaces and things like that. So I think you have to be really clear about your specific angle of methodology, and you have to realize that, we can't just imagine it's a universal, benign, and benevolent audience. And what might show up is going to be very different, and we have to kind of plan ahead of time for that. And make the sort of decisions, the political decisions of what that means. So again, I would say like Jane Austen, you can't, if you had it just as sort of what we would think of as a very traditional, neutral Jane Austen archive, it would be swarmed. It would totally be swarmed, right? And it would be used in very specific ways. They would take off images and do like really intent alt-right memes, so I think this is the thing where all of a sudden we have to start to think about, well, which communities do we want to center and how are we going to actually, what is the argument for the archive? Which actually in the end is a good scholarly practice anyhow, because archives are never neutral. So we all are supposed to have arguments about what we think the frames of our archive are about, what the stakes are, what the sort of narrative trajectory is, what is our intellectual investment in it, right? So I think it's just, we have to be more aware of the fact that, we can't just say, oh, the general public, this kind of wide and they're sort of lovely and benign way, because not all of them are. A lot of them are not benign, and a lot of them want to do things like leave really terrible and horrible things, When I was attacked in the fall, one of the interesting things that happened is that the Medievalist Scholar Scalar site, which is run out of Reclaim Hosting, which is really great, and they're really on top of the security, but for some reason there was like a back-end entrance that had been left open, and as soon as I was attacked, like various sites that had my name were immediately attacked. They went after that and like released a bunch of like pornographic material, right? So this is what I mean. Like you have to kind of think about, well, the audience out there is not benign necessarily, and then, well, if we're building these databases, what do we do? How do you build a really both theoretical and critical database or project about the Crusades that doesn't somehow end up becoming political fodder, right? For these very, very intense fascist arguments about, clash of civilizations and why we must, start another war in the Middle East. On the flip side, there's also this question that I've had recently of like, you know, the government is collecting data, and that can be used, as we know, historically, and we can see sort of now, against various communities. What do we do in digital humanities where we've been really pushing to have a lot of the projects, say, historically related to sort of like African American activism, but also, you know, things like the Black Panthers and also Black Lives Matter. There was a whole, like, I think it was funded by the National Endowment for IMLS and things like that, project about archiving Black Lives Matter. But what do you do when basically the FBI have decided to create a dossier of Black identified, you know, extremists, right? So we're back to this sort of moment of, I think we just never thought community back to this kind of almost Hoover 50s, 60s, 70s era moment where we're like, okay, so the things that we want to do projects about, where we're collecting data of, say, certain activists, this can be turned over to the government for we don't know what, you know. And so I think there's a whole question of like, well, what do you do? And I think it's an interesting mind right now. Like you know, is there a way to anonymize the data? Is there a way to sort of like, how do you not hand over that sort of thing? I mean, Ula Taylor at UC Berkeley got some money to do a Black Panther, a Black Panther documentary about Black Panthers in Oakland, which totally makes sense. Berkeley, local. She got money from the Postal Service, I believe, for some of the documentary. That was taken away from her without explanation after the election. So, I mean, there are some very interesting questions about, you know, we want to center certain communities, especially in this particularly fraught political time, but there's also this question of like, that actually doing some of these projects is a form of surveillance for these communities, right? So what, like, how do you work around that, right? I think this is a question that anyone who works in data has to think about. I had this like personal discussion with my brother, who is an environmental scientist who works on green buildings and like green architecture, and had at one point had been working with a startup to basically create this like little piece of tape that they could put on like every household's like energy like consumption, which you think, okay, that's really useful because then you can kind of figure out like how much everyone uses and then like make policy decisions. But one of the questions that I had for him was like, yeah, but like the deal is, where does this data go to? You know, does this mean that companies they take certain neighborhoods, they realize certain communities are using this amount of energy, but then they will like spike the prices on them, right? Because, you know, so there's this whole question of like, the idea or the intent is really good, but then there's this whole question of like thinking through the rest of it. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to anonymize this data? Are you going to hand it over to certain government or other agencies or predatory like companies? Well, you know, I mean, we are, when does net neutrality end? It ends this month, right? We will see that happen very soon, where certain areas and certain people will be charged certain amounts of money to be able to get on the internet at certain speeds, right? So like, what are, you know, there are these sorts of questions that I think we have to now start to really like dig into and things like that. And you know, I mean, if nothing else, the Cambridge Analytica stuff all should make that really, really clear thing. I mean, I do think the whistleblower thing is really interesting, that has really been what's fueled this last round of things.
Yeah. So I have a question, as a person who actually has built a database about taken by the, or I did a translation of a Venetian chronicle that has been adopted by somewhere, adopted by university. And you know, my response to what a lot of people have, you know, considered really costly use of that work has not been to, or has been to try to evaluate really, but rather to try to co-opt those folks into, and to bring them into the conversational way. That makes them feel less defensive or less like using my material as a weapon, right? And so in lieu of saying, oh, this idiot, he just took my stuff, now he's using it, for this terrible purpose, is to when I can come in contact with them say, oh, I'm so glad that you're interested in this. I've done some work on this, and what I found is contrary to how it's really being used. And so to kind of co-opt that person into that conversation in a way that makes them feel part of the process and makes them, have sort of like an insider knowledge, right? And that then perpetuates sort of a de-mystification or sort of, de-weaponization of that work, right? Because then he becomes the guy who's like, look, I talked to a woman, and she told me that it's not really this, it's that, right? So they become kind of the purveyors of a different sort of ethos, right? So to the extent that we could, as people who have spent our lives, learning about medieval history or whatever else that we do, right? If we can, in lieu of assuming that everybody else has the same amount of knowledge that we have, instead kind of try to make, be a friend, right? In whatever way, it's difficult, but there have been times when that's been kind of successful for me. So I offer that as a potential other route.
I think it depends on
No, absolutely.
a whole range of things. I think the issue would be, I would never do that, mostly because they're trying to kill me. And I would also say, particularly in a classroom situation, this also then puts a lot of your marginalized students in a very complicated position of feeling that the white supremacist who wants to make a decision about where they want to be or where their labor is going to be for certain things. I think the one issue I would have is that you're imagining that this is not ideological, but about logic, right? And a lot of this is not about logic. Like, we can say all these things and point to these things and go, yes, there were actually bodies of color in medieval Europe pre-1500, before the transatlantic or the sort of really huge, moments of the transatlantic slave trade. And here are examples, here are documents, here are sort of images, but that does not stop them. It's interesting that logic and evidence does not stop the ideology from saying, not only saying no and not believing these things, but also then sort of going after you violently. So, I think the thing is it's really dependent on it's a decision people have to make, but I will say that most people of color are not going to make that decision because they're going to be they have a target on their back. Most Jews and Muslims would not make this decision either. And a lot of women wouldn't make this decision as well because they too have a target on their back from particular areas of the sort of gamer world. I think the thing is that I would say, it's ideology as opposed to imagine persuasion and logic. So I'm interested in fighting the ideology. If I think, yes, more information is useful. I think actual evidence-based information is useful out there in the world, but I don't know if trying to persuade with evidence-based information works on certain groups. It hasn't so far. I think the anti-fascists basically say you fight the fascists. It's ideology, no one ever said, if you read some of the medieval stuff that some of the alt-right are really interested in, like Julius Evola or sort of other people, it's not logical ever. Their sort of visions of the world and things like that, and their ideas of dark enlightenment, their ideas of what world history should be like, etc. Not logical. Also, it depends on the group, right? There are very vast and multiplied universe, right? The KKK who identify don't have the same ideology as other parts of the alt-right. They have different genealogies and different things. Interestingly, in some of the ideas they think about history in fact. The KKK have a very specific idea of American history. I just spent some time with Kelly Baker, who's written about the Klan and religion. They have a very specific idea both about religion and also about the trajectory of American history. That certain nodes of the alt-right, that sort of Bannon and others, don't actually. This is a complete opposite notion and vision. So, I think basically it's a question of what energies and labor you want to do, but I don't know if that necessarily works since it's ideological rather than logical.
Question about, what do you think there are some authors or works or issues that are not applicable, because I'm thinking about Jane Austen, the approach to Austen that we went through in the canon was to expand the canon around Austen to indicate that Austen herself, who absolutely puts at the center right British culture. There's a reason why the alt-right gravitates towards Austen. And that, whatever frame that you put the data in about Austen, as long as Austen is at the center of that, your mechanism in a way replicates that is in Austen's work, because you could approach it through reception of Austen's work, which really is an imperialist exploitation of that. You could do it through adaptation, but I'm just wondering about what the continuation of databases about Austen as opposed to databases about other authors, which is the approach and the expansion, the original expansion of the canon, and the addition of more forces on other authors that were writing at the time, which seems a slightly different issue to what you're getting at with the sort of how do we do it in the digital humanities. I just wondered about your idea.
One of the things is the issue, digital humanities, especially large funded, multi-collaborative projects, one of the top ways to get funded, or one of the top questions is like the importance, right? The importance, the cultural, whatever, which is why it's very complicated for things like Chicana Raza to get funded versus Austen, versus basically canonical big names, basically, right? And yeah.
It specifically says there's nothing political, no political projects, but it's difficult because how do they construe a political project?
Well, I think this is also why it's very, because they also fund a lot of history projects. So they helped fund, some of the money went to sort of archiving the hashtag Black Lives Matter, So I think it's fairly capacious. I think they have to say that because of what's going on politically, but I think their sort of width of what is not political or political is actually quite wide. But I would say with Austen, I think it would be better if it was a whole set of other authors. I think Tricia Matthews, and especially her articles in The Atlantic about how she hates Austen and hates teaching Austen is actually a good way to get into that discussion. But I think this is the thing with, I think we would have the same question of like, what do we do with Chaucer, right? How do you deal with this, documented rapist? Also, like, a whole bunch of other things, sort of his sort of reach into the canon after his life is an arm of imperialism, right? I think Global Chaucers has tried really hard to push back on that, to think about how do various groups of writers take the Chaucer and push back on that in some way, right? Beyond just a sort of adaptation. So I think, there's a lot of room to kind of think about the intellectual questions of this. I think the Austen thing, I think you're right. I think there is a reason why people latch on to that. And they're not latching on to like Frederick Douglass. They're not latching on to, other authors, right? As I said, they're not latching on to Shakespeare, which you would think they would latch on to, but no, in the field. Right, so I think this is something that also needs to kind of be thought through and discussed and stuff like that. And I think that, like, I have been an NIH reviewer. I cannot talk about particulars, but I can talk about process, right? And I've been an NIH reviewer twice. And I would say that, I think they are very clear when they talk about it, they say they cannot be political, but they fund a whole range of projects, right? Is it political to fund a project that basically is, a Native American community, like editing one of their core texts? Yeah, it's political, but is it political, right? So, I think it's a kind of wide range. I mean, I think particularly a lot of their projects related to history and, like, American cultural life, 19th, 20th century. I would say there's an interesting range of things that they decide to fund that they're saying is not political, but has very interesting politics in their, point of view, if that makes sense. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a question. I mentioned Cambridge Analytica a couple times, and
yes.
And I was intrigued by where you think it's going to go. I was also intrigued by talking about IBM and World War II, and I was thinking about World War I and World War II, this depression that sits over Europe, thinking about how technology made these wars horrible and awful, the technology that was supposed to do so much good. I was wondering where you think Cambridge Analytica is going to go, because this is data that they didn't create, it was freely given, they just harvested. And it's kind of, do you see this kind of pessimism over social media settling in? Or?
I mean, it's interesting because if you read Zena Tufekci's articles in the New York Times or any of her work or her book on social media and like revolutions, they already have your data. The cow's out of the barn, and they can actually recreate your profile without you being there, right? They have 10 years of data on you. And I mean, actually more interesting for me, and something that maybe I will at some point write up, because I've actually thought about IRB and social media and ethics and things like that, is that the fact is actually, like, Facebook handed it over because basically it was a academic who had IRB approval, right? And basically then had Facebook hand over the thing. And the whole point was that the academic was to make sure that people consented to have their data be handed over with this questionnaire. But what happened was that the data was not just people who consented, but all their friends. And then they're all their friends, which is why you get 10 million people in that particular thing. I think what people have talked about, a number of people, is Facebook has, they had that 2014 mood experiment. They've had huge legal problems in terms of their sort of collaboration with academia, and sort of that was IRB passed too. So you're just like, what happened there? I think there's an interesting discussion about the fact that the IRB has not really understood the fact that your digital body is also your real body. So it's human subject research, so it needs to be addressed. I think it's a question of, like, understanding the business models, right? The point is that this is not going to happen with Apple, because Apple makes you pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for their iPhone, and so they're interested in guarding your privacy, right, and your personal information. While Facebook and sort of several other spots, Facebook is also Instagram, is also, it will be interesting to see if the various kind of government pressures from both the UK and Europe as well as North America will push back on that. I think it's really difficult. I mean, because I think about the digital world and sort of various factors. YouTube is like a big space. It's a very interesting platform. It's a big space where a lot of radicalization of very extreme right happens, right? You can get me in a conversation about cryptocurrency and how that is actually funding the alt-right, right? It's sort of interesting set of specific issues related to specific platforms. I will say that, though, again, it's this whole, I think one of the things is that after the election, people really, the 2016 US election, people really started to kind of see in mainstream media daily this discussion about their data, right? And the sort of data breaches and privacy and sort of how data can harm people, that I think were discussions in certain academic circles, in certain kinds of tech journalism, right? We all kind of knew this, right? But we didn't, it has become a much more ongoing, in-your-face topic online. I mean, one of the things, I started my digital humanities methods class with my student, asking all of them this semester, so who decided to take a picture of their face to find their face and what matched in the art museum universe, right? There are two issues with that. One, so you just handed over your biometric data to Google so that they could refine their OCR, right? And now they have an image of your face. And two, if you are a Black, Indigenous person of color, the data set is messed up, right? Because who's usually the images in these art museums? So that's why you end up you and a couple of your Asian friends always end up with the same person, that you're supposed to have been matched to. So, I think these are the kinds of things. I think, I don't think it's going to, I'm not a techno-utopia person. I use all this stuff, I analyze it, I work on it, I think about media platforms a lot. I think maybe I'm more like a techno-realist. I think it's good to know what the kind of horrible stuff could be, right? And you kind of have to understand how far that can go. The biometric data is really frightening because, of course, they're starting to think about taking the biometric data and doing things like, should we hire this person depending on how healthy they are, right? So it becomes a whole other issue and things like that. Yes?
I think this would be our last question.
On the same track of where you think some of these databases are going, I'm just curious if you had any experience with or kind of a caution about these DNA databases, people sending in their DNA.
Bad idea.
Who is actually collecting these things? I don't know who looked into
Like a
this.
bad idea. There's really interesting work that debunks some of these sites, especially how it wants to break down racial profiles. There was that excellent article of all places in BuzzFeed where 68 or 80 some various scholars and scientists and specialists basically wrote this long letter piece to push back against that New York Times article about race and genetics and things like that. So I think if you're going to do something like that, you do it with the sort of frame out of very specific medical permissions that are supposed to not hand over your data, right, in any way, because it's in your medical file and so completely. I would be very careful, basically. Yeah, I think, I think it's one thing if the entirety of Iceland decides as a group they do want to map out the entire genome. That's 300,000 people, give or take. There are no sheep on the island, but they're doing it as a sort of kind of island, mass scientific experiment to kind of think about disease and sort of all this stuff, right? And I think for the Icelanders, they also live in a very robust, democratic society. They protest, they hate their politicians, they have punished their politicians in the past. They've even had a pirate radio guy be a politician, so their government system is much more robust about protecting their privacy and their personal liberties, right? I don't think this would be a good idea in other parts of the world. I think this would be a really bad idea, and things like that. So I think it will be dependent on various conditions on the ground. We already, what was it, a couple of years ago, John Hopkins had to pay, or we're basically told to pay $1 billion to a group of Guatemalans because they had infected them with, STDs, right? So, it's there's a whole set of questions, I think. What bodies matter, what bodies can do these things, which bodies don't want to give information over, and where are we in that discussion, if that makes sense? So.
I'd like to encourage us to continue that discussion over drinks on the patio outside. And second of all, I'd like to have us all thank Dorothy Kim for talking to us today.
Yeah.